Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for George Washington's Vine and Fig Tree, Micah 4:4, and the Religious Character of the American Republic. We are honored to be co-hosting today's program with Temple High in Phoenix and BMHBJ in Denver. And I'd love to pass it over to Rabbi Chaitovsky to introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. And we're in for a real treat today. Dr. Tugendhaft is an expert in history and philosophy, studied at University of Chicago, as well as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Sorbonne. He received a doctorate in Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies from NYU and has taught broadly within the humanities on 4 continents and has become a staunch advocate of traditional liberal education as a corrective to premature professionalization, academic hyper-specialization, and political polarization. He's written a number of books, including his most recent, The Idols of Isis, From Assyria to the Internet. It's a philosophical meditation on the political power of images and the significance of their destruction. He has served since 2021 as the History Department Chair and Director of Interdisciplinary Programs at the Ramaz School in New York City, a flagship modern Orthodox high school and lower school and high school in our country. And he's going to talk today about Micah, an image that was very dear to the heart of George Washington, very dear to us. And if you're concerned about a vision for society, you might be intrigued and enlightened by the presentation today. Doctor?
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you, Alex, for this invitation. I'm very glad to be here at the Valley Beit Midrash. I am currently coming to you from Leiden in the Netherlands, just to let you know, but it's my pleasure to join all of you, so thank you for the invitation. Here, Washington quoting from scripture, and he's quoting the line about one's own vine and fig tree, which, by the way, and we'll get to this, the scene, right, one last time, has to do with the writing of Washington's famous farewell address. That's actually one of the places that he does not quote this line. Otherwise, it was arguably his favorite scriptural verse, and he quotes it more than 4 dozen times in his letters. And so just can look at the full passage, four verses from Micah to give the context, right? But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow onto it. And many nations shall come, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this passage, not only the line at the end. It is a prophetic vision of the last days, right, or of the time to come, some type of messianic time. There are interesting things that are relevant to some of the themes that will come up today, though I won't necessarily speak to them directly, but we can maybe talk about them after the presentation, about many nations coming together, and, as we'll see, also the image of the swords being beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks is particularly relevant for the moment in history that we're going to be talking about. I mentioned that Washington quotes this line or alludes to this image more than 4 dozen times in his letters. And most of the occurrences take place during 2 periods of his life when he took a step back from public life. This letter from 1784, right, is the period when he gives up his commission as head of the army, and he returns to Mount Vernon. And then the other period is after he, just connected to the song we just saw, after he returns and does not run for president after a second term. So this is letter to the Marquis de Lafayette from 1 February 1784. Washington writes, "At length, my dear Marquis, I am become a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac, and under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree, free from the bustle of a camp and the busy scenes of public life, I am solacing myself with those tranquil enjoyments of which the soldier who is ever in pursuit of fame and the courtier who is always watching the countenance of his prince can have very little conception." And so here we can see the image of the vine and fig tree is being used as an image of a private life, right? Washington here is building off of the classical distinction between public life, the life of the statesman or the general, the soldier, and a private life. And he uses the vine and fig tree image to describe his retreat from public life, right, and his time as a private citizen finally at Mount Vernon. And that indeed is the way that the image is used most of the time in his writing, but not always. Probably the most famous usage of the image, and certainly among those who are interested in the history of Jews in America and Washington's relationship to Jews, is in a letter, a very famous letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, which Washington wrote 18th of August, 1790. And as you see down in the red, he quotes, I'll read the whole, this is not the whole letter, but significant portion of it, because some of these themes will return, and it's worth reading. It's also just important in its own right. Washington writes, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." And so we see here quite a different use than the use that he applies the phrase in the letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, right? Here, it is a particularly political usage of the phrase, that the political character of the United States is going to be one, and should be one, where everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree. And importantly, that Jews will be included in that group who will benefit from that situation. Now, Washington, of course, is not the first to use this phrase in a political meaning. Arguably, of course, the original sense itself, with its messianic vision, is somehow political, though we can get into some of the fine details there of whether that term is appropriate. But within the American context, it's interesting to look at some of the predecessors who used this phrase in the rhetoric of the time. On the 8th of May, 1778, the Congress of the United States published this address to the inhabitants of the United States of America. This is in the middle of the war at a time when things were not going particularly well for the United States, and much of the letter, much of this text is aimed at basically scaring Americans out of the contemplating the idea of surrender to the British. And it's in that context that the text reads, "Trust not to appearances of peace and security. Be assured that, unless you persevere, you will be exposed to every species of barbarity. But if you exert the means of defense which God and nature have given you, the time will soon arrive when every man shall sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid," right? And so we see here the image is being used specifically for that time that comes after the war and after success in the war, that and the country that emerges should be a country that is characterized by this image. And of course, the transition from war to peace, right? Also, one can connect to the image of the beating swords into plowshares, which Micah uses in tandem with the vine and fig tree. And so the question then becomes, when does this period arrive, if it arrives at all? This sermon on the occasion of the commencement of the New Hampshire Constitution, Reverend Samuel McClintock states, "By this revolution, we are not only delivered from the calamities of a long, expensive, and bloody war, but may now sit quietly under our own vine and fig tree, without any to make us afraid. And every man is left at full liberty to pursue the means of opulence and happiness, without the danger of being deprived of the fruits of his industry by the hand of rapine and violence, which is ever the case of those who are either the subjects of arbitrary power or exposed to the ravages of war." Now, this text has to be understood. This text comes from the period of the Articles of Confederation and needs to be understood, as does the next text even more explicitly, in the question of whether or not those Articles of Confederation were sufficient for American governance. And as you can see here, right, there are those like McClintock who claim, right, that the war is now over and that they now actively are living in a world, in a situation characterized by the prophetic vision. And so they can now enjoy that liberty, which has already arrived. Similarly, 3 years later, Melancthon Smith calls himself a plebeian in this text. "Evils under Confederation's exaggerated constitution must be drastically revised before adoption." This is known as Anti-Federalist 85, right? And so, and again, those of you familiar with Hamilton will be familiar with this, as well as just from American history, right? There was a large debate as to whether or not the Constitution should be ratified, accepted, and that debate ended up being sort of divided between these two groups, the so-called Federalists, most famously Jay, Hamilton, and Madison, who wrote the letters that then came together as the Federalist Papers. These Federalist Papers, right, arguing in favor of adoption of the new Constitution, and then those who opposed the adoption of the Constitution being labeled the Anti-Federalists. Okay, and here we have the voice of one of the Anti-Federalists. He writes, On this head, all the powers of rhetoric and arts of description are employed by the Federalists to paint the condition of this country in the most hideous and frightful colors, right? That is, that if one were to read the writings of the Federalists, they would say that the current situation is under the Articles of Confederation are appalling, right? And cannot continue. They're frightful and hideous. But Smith continues, but suffer me, my countrymen, to call your attention to a serious and sober estimate of the situation in which you are placed. What is your condition? Does not every man sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, having none to make him afraid? Does not everyone follow his calling without impediments and receive the reward of his well-earned industry? And so again, we can see how this prophetic image is used as already applicable to the current situation, the situation after victory in the Revolutionary War, and the idea that at that point, Americans had achieved a world that meets this prophetic vision, and nothing more needed to be done in order to achieve it. But then there are those who disagreed. As it happens so often, right? They use the same image, but for different purpose. And so here is John Dickinson, who signed himself his essay Fabius, in the essay Observations on the Constitution proposed by the Federal Convention. So one of the pro-Constitution writings, this is from April 1788. Dickinson writes, each individual then must contribute such a share of his rights as is necessary for attaining that security that is essential to freedom. What does he lose by this submission? The power of doing injuries to others and the dread of suffering injuries from them. What does he gain by it? Protection against injuries, a capacity of enjoying his undelegated rights to the best advantage, a repeal of his fears, and tranquility of mind. Or, in other words, that perfect liberty better described in the Holy Scriptures than anywhere else in these expressions, when every man shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. Right? And so, to Dickinson, the prophetic image remains the image that one wants for America, but it is not yet achieved. It's something that can be achieved in the future if the country is willing to undergo the necessary submission to certain types of government. Right, in this case, right, the Constitution. In other words, that in order to gain true liberty, right, individuals will have to give up some of their personal liberty, or the liberty that and freedom that they understand. But it's only by doing so that the larger civic liberty that republicanism aims for can be achieved, and that according to Dickinson, those who claim that we currently already are there, we don't need to submit to a stronger government, right, are not willing to recognize and make the sacrifices necessary for good governance, and the life of perfect liberty that can emerge from it. If in the previous text from Dickinson, right, which takes place during the Federalist debates, the debates on the Constitution, focuses on what the citizens need to be willing to undergo in order for a healthy civic society to emerge in America, and then that America can take on the image of that prophetic vision. In this text, which is quite a bit earlier, as you see, it's from 1747 by the Boston preacher Charles Chauncey. He focuses on the ruler. It is in this text, civil magistrates must be just, ruling in the fear of God, which he preached before the newly appointed governor of the Massachusetts colony and the council members in 1747. And the whole text is about the requirements of good governance and how a ruler specifically should behave. The whole text is a commentary on a verse from 2 Samuel. But at one moment in the text, Chauncey writes, "The happiness of a people lies very much in their living peaceably among themselves and at quiet with their neighbors. For which reason, rulers are bound in justice to use all prudent endeavors, that they may sit every man under his own vine and under his fig tree, and have none to make them afraid. In order whereunto they should take care to prevent intestine jars and commotions in the government, by giving no occasion for murmurings and complaints, or if any should unhappily arise, by speedily removing the causes of them." I want you to notice a subtle shift in Chauncey's use of this phrase. Until now, following the usage of the prophet himself, the verb sit has always been used in its intransitive sense. Here, however, Chauncey does something that which we can do in English, subtly shifts it so that the word sit here is used transitively, meaning that it is the job of the ruler to actively sit citizens under their vine and fig tree, right? That there is a role that rulers must play in order to achieve this goal. And it's with that in mind that I want us to turn back to George Washington and think about George Washington in terms of what he, as president, tried to accomplish, right? Or how he tried to accomplish this act of sitting every man under his own vine and fig tree, right? What did he think that he needed to do vis-a-vis citizens of the United States so that this could be this image, right, for the United States could be accomplished? Because as should be mentioned, right, I'm sure most of you know, Washington himself, right, was in favor of adopting the Constitution, and so he did not believe, like the Anti-Federalists, that the prophetic situation had been achieved nationally, right, in its political use, even if he could say that he personally had achieved it at Mount Vernon, right? But in its political usage, he was thinking of it as a future vision, not as something already accomplished. And so how did he do that? And specifically, how did he do it with respect to the issue that seems to concern Chauncey here particularly, which is this question of murmurings and complaints or divisions within the populace, right? Or the problem of sectarianism and the rise of sects, which is one of the principal concerns of these thinkers. To do that, let's return to our beginning, right? And the farewell address that George Washington circulated before stepping down from office. And I want to focus here. We could think about how George Washington tried to accomplish this in many, many different ways, right? How he tried to sit the American population under their vine and fig tree. But I want to focus specifically on the question of religion. And in the farewell address, he has this to say about religion. "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. Right. So what is he saying? He's saying that in order to achieve political prosperity, right, we need the indispensable supports of religion and morality, and that no one who can claim to be a patriot, right, would ever work to undermine religion and morality within the civic community, right? That any attempt to try to undermine this would be to act against patriotism, right? And that the politician, meaning the person who is just thinking about practical politics, equally with the pious man. So it doesn't matter whether you're thinking from the perspective of practical politics or from the perspective of piety, right? Both types of man respects and cherishes religion in the population, right? And by the way, I should mention here that there's been a lot written and a lot of speculation about whether Washington himself was pious, and if so, in what way, and what was his personal convictions and beliefs, right? I'm not that's a worthwhile thing to be concerned about, but it's not my concern here in thinking about Washington. I'm more interested in thinking about him, regardless of his personal beliefs, what as a politician he thought the role religion should play in America. And so then he continues, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle, right? And so it's possible that we can get morality with religion, perhaps. Maybe those who have a refined education can achieve that. But he says both reason and experience, right? If we actually just look around, we have to come to the conclusion that for national morality to prevail, right, it can't prevail without population partaking in some religious principle. Okay, what that religious principle is, though, is left a little vague, and I think that that's in this sort of the closing point that I want to get to is incredibly important, because he does not say, for example, as many at the time would very well have said, right, that it cannot prevail without Christian morality or something of that sort. And yet, instead, he says religious principle. Now, to get at that question, I want to trouble things a little bit. So Washington here says that in order to have civic virtues, the civic virtues that are so indispensable for a republic, right? Realistically, one needs a population that has religion, and therefore it's politically prudent for the government to not only not try to undermine it, but even Washington will go so far as to say to nurture that religious feeling in the population. But if the government gets involved in nurturing that religion in the population, the chance that it raises the chances, given the fact that different people disagree on religion and they have irreconcilable differences of opinion about religion, right? If the government encourages religion, might not that encourage sectarianism? Might not that encourage strife? Precisely those things, right, that Chauncey is suggesting that a ruler has to try to suppress and bring and eradicate from the polity. Might supportive religion might it not instead bring about people caring so much about their religion that they are at the throats of others who disagree with them within the polity. And so with the last few minutes, I just want to mention, and I'm not going to be able to go into this, right? One place where it seems that Washington had a strategy for dealing with this. Now, I mentioned at the beginning one of the most famous, if not the most famous, occurrences of the phrase about the vine and fig tree appears in the letter, the justly famed letter of Washington to the Hebrew congregation in Newport. But what's less known is that that letter was just one of many letters that George Washington wrote in this period upon becoming the first president of the United States to religious communities throughout the new United States of America. So there were many letters that he wrote, and this is a list of them, right? As you can see, to the German Lutherans of Philadelphia, to the bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church, to the United Baptist Churches of Virginia, to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, to the German Reformed congregations, to the Moravian Society for Propagating the Gospel, to the Society of Quakers, to the Congregational Ministers of New Haven, to the Presbyterian ministers of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, to the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Church in North America, to Roman Catholics in America, to the Society of Free Quakers, to the Savannah, Georgia Hebrew Congregation, to the Convention of the Universal Church, to the Hebrew Congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, to the Hebrew congregations of Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Richmond, to the Congregational Church of Midway, Georgia, and to the members of the New Jerusalem Church of Baltimore. So as you can see, even just for Jewish history, the letter to Newport is only one of 3 letters that Washington wrote in this period to Jewish communities in the United States. Now, Washington didn't just choose to write these letters. In fact, all of these letters are responses that he received from these different communities upon his inauguration as the president. And this is a practice that was also common. It goes back to a practice in monarchies, and it's a whole other topic, right? The question at this time of how to distinguish Washington as president from a monarch and such. But there's a practice, right, for religious communities to send letters upon the coronation, and so in this case, the inauguration, sometimes called the coronation of Washington. And Washington responded. Interestingly, when he responded, he often quoted pieces of the letters back to the congregation. What's interesting when one looks at these letters in detail, and at the bottom of the page there, and also on the source sheet that I have circulated to you, I give you the web address of Mount Vernon has a webpage, a wonderful webpage, which collects all of these letters and includes all of the letters that Washington received and that he was responding to, right? And if you take them all in aggregate and start looking at what Washington is doing, you realize that he has a certain kind of method. That, first of all, with minority or marginalized communities, not just the Jewish community of the United States, but also in this sense, Quakers and Catholics, he adopts a position that, through his language, tries to bring the community, those communities, closer to the center, and or make them more included within American life. And there are a range of other things we could talk about how he does that, right? But he tries to bring them closer to the center. While on the other hand, if you look at, for example, the letter to the Presbyterians, churches that were more established in America and thought of themselves as dominant and deserving of a certain kind of respect that comes with that in America, you can see him, by contrast, actually cutting them down somewhat, moderating them, and thereby also trying to bring them into a kind of more central middle position or position of equality between these different congregations. An example of that, for example, is that whereas when the Presbyterian Church writes to Washington, they write explicitly of Christ and Christians and Jesus, right? And when Washington replies, and remember, he has a tendency to quote the congregations back to themselves. He very, very one can see this very clearly, that he does not refer to Christianity or Christ or Jesus. He cuts all of that out and uses far more ecumenical, more universal language to refer to the deity. And he does this throughout. And so there really is this attempt to recognize the sectarianism in the United States, right? And Washington recognizes as his duty as president not to support some sects over others, but rather to find means to bring the marginalized into the center and those in the in the center, bring them down so that there creates a kind of equality between the different sects, not homogeneity, right? There isn't division, as is the vision in Micah, to bring it all the way back to the poet, to the prophet, right? If the vision of the prophet is that all nations will come to Jerusalem and recognize finally the one true God, right, and give up their false gods, and therefore everyone comes together through a kind of unified religion. Here, Washington is seeking a kind of unification, but not in the form of a homogenized religion in any respect, right? But rather a complete sort of equality between different congregations. I'm 1 minute over, but I will stop there. I welcome any conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tugendhaft. Yes, we'd love to open it up. If anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on you, and then you can unmute, or you can also use the chat if you'd prefer. Hi, I saw Rabbi Chaitovsky and then Tikva.
I'm just fascinated. What prompted your interest? Where did this interest in Americana, George Washington, his love of the Micah image, what spurred that?
Oh, it's a good question. I never really know where my interest in things come from, to be honest. I have in recent years become more and more interested in the early modern period in general, not so much America. That this is actually so those of you who know a lot more than this than I do, I'm sure saw plenty of faults in the presentation. I'm new. This is a new project for me, and I want to move into doing more with Americana. But I've been doing a lot with early modern political thought and early modern thinking about religion and politics, and so that's one part of this for sure. I suppose, I mean, there is a thematic thing here, which is the image that I close with at the end, or a problem at the end that I think I've been interested in a lot of my work in different ways, right? Which is precisely how to live together without a demand for perfection as one understands perfection, right? How to live somewhat willingly in a situation of incompleteness, right? Because in this period, right, each one of these sects, right, it's really important, as it will still be the case today but they believe that, right, they have it right, and they know for sure how things are supposed to get done, and so one could imagine that if you're going to have an ideal politics, or strive for the best politics possible, you would want it to have one proper viewpoint on religion and all things, right? And I'm interested in precisely how we can try to avoid that, right? And sort of live with imperfection and incompleteness. And so that's why I become interested in these letters that Washington sends that I mentioned at the end.
Thank you. Yes, Tikva?
Yeah, I guess I was struck just right from the beginning, and I think you brought this out so well, Aaron, of seeing the song within the context of like this lecture, Even in the song, you hear both that he is the person who wants everyone to be under their own vine and fig tree, and he himself wants to be under his own vine and fig tree. And I love the way you brought out the different tensions between, or different, I guess, even complementary sides between the political and the personal is political. And it's just like very aspirational to think about leaders really understanding that, and at a time when it was such a radical thought, like, and to see it in that. I'm just always surprised anew by Washington's just like vision and the founding fathers' vision, and are we the sort of worthy recipients of moving forward that vision, making sure that it lasts.
Oh, thank you. I mean,
thank you.
In a way, your comment makes me think, and sadly, I appreciate it, but it's also somewhat sad, right? That makes one wonder. So the first thought, sorry, bumbling the words, that to what extent is Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton precisely also some kind of a work that aims to achieve this goal of sitting us under our vine and fig tree in America today? And if there is something to that, right? To what extent is he trying to achieve that more than, say, our own politicians in a lot of ways, right? Precisely today, and I think that there's also, it's worth mentioning, right, that there's critique of his vision from certain quarters as well for precisely doing that, for being a work that tries to bring people into the American vision, right? And in that sense, is somewhat similar to Washington, by those who want to curse the American vision, right? Or right, like to say that actually, no, that's not something that we want to be. Those are not vines and fig trees that we want to be under, right? And so I think that the work itself is interesting in how it tries to how it believes in that, in America, in that as a polity that can actually achieve that in some sense.
Thank you. There was a question from Jenny that came in the chat. Was there general discussion, response, or recognition to his views by his contemporaries?
Contemporaries,
Contemporaries, probably supposed to be.
Yeah. Absolutely. In the basic sense, right? Like everything that Washington did was, discussed and responded to and recognized because he was Washington. But maybe I'll read into the question a little bit, right? And say that Washington's position here, right, is not the only position, especially about the role of religion in American life, that that was held by the founders, right? So I'll be honest, I like it. I do think that there's something realistic about recognizing that religion is a part of it can be a meaningful part of human life and can bring about some of the things that we want to see in citizens better than if we tried to bring those about in the general population without religion, right? And so I think that this is from a purely political perspective. If one wants to achieve citizens sort of worthy of Republican life, that religion can be a way of achieving that, and that it would be foolish to throw away. But different people, others disagreed, right? Jefferson was definitely more anti-clerical. Madison famously, right, did not think that the United States should be involved in supporting religion to the extent that Washington seemed that he was willing. So there were debates about these issues that were alive then and are still alive today.
Thank you. Hi, Aglaia, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just really dizzy today, so sorry. There's something that I'm kind of wondering about here, though, is that and I'm not sure how far along you are with this research and everything like that. So if you've addressed this, I'm really sorry. But I'm thinking about the impact that the First Great Awakening had on creating the American Revolution. A lot of the time that people well, I shouldn't say exaggerate, but they stress this, the founding fathers, and they're listening to, people like John Locke and this rationalism and everything like that. But the First Great Awakening also inspired people, even though it's a bunch of it's a bunch of nobodies out in the middle of nowhere having their own personal religious experiences. So I don't know if you've already addressed that aspect or not, though, but I just wanted to throw that out there in case.
Thank you. It's so important, and it's as I think you rightly have sensed, it's a part of the story that I'm aware of. It's not a part that I've done enough with, but I can mention one thing in that context, because I do think it's interesting, right? Is that Charles Chauncey, who I quote, right, who I think just does this wonderful job at tweaking the verse to put it into the transitive, right? He was notable for being one of the most antagonistic ministers against the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening. And so it is interesting to think about the political thought of both sides, and how both the more rational religion and the enthusiasm can ultimately contribute, right, to these issues. I think that Washington, but again, this is Washington falls more in line with the Chauncey view, right? But you're absolutely right to say that the Great Awakening has to be taken into the project.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you, do you believe that theistic rationalists then more of a middle ground?
I'm sorry?
Do you buy into the whole idea that George Washington is more theistic rationalist, and that would make him kind of a middle ground between the stark deist of the founding fathers and the Great Awakening?
Right. So, to be honest, as I mentioned, I kind of want to bracket that debate as to what he was, right? And I'm not saying that I just don't know, and I certainly don't know better than the people who have been arguing these views, right? And I'm familiar with the one you're referring to in saying that he's not a pure deist. But in a way, I'm interested in how he's operating as a political leader, right? Rather than necessarily what his own views were. And I think that that's actually an interesting way to take it, because it helps us to understand what statesmen, a better word for it, right? What their responsibilities are, in a way, regardless of their own personal beliefs.
Hi, Rabbi Simons.
Hi, Barbara. This is fabulous. Thank you so much. So interesting. So with the idea of religion and morality both being required, and I did a quick Google search, not being much of a scholar on any of this, that John Adams said that you can't have democracy without both religion and morality. So given the drop in religion, or at least religious affiliation, what do you think the impact is on where we are now and where we're going?
Wow. Okay. I'm definitely not qualified to answer. I mean, I can have.
Right.
You're probably more qualified, I'm guessing, than I am. But I guess I'll answer with, again, and this is me just putting myself out there for, sort of honest, personal, right? One should never do, certainly not when it's being recorded, right? I mentioned earlier that I've become interested in the early modern period, and there are a whole bunch of caveats that I feel like I need to make, because once I say this, what I'm about to say, right, I know I can be pounced on from so many different directions. But all of those caveats, right, accepting them, I think that there's a kind of way that one sees people thinking about politics and political life and civic duty in this period that's healthy, right? Obviously, there are huge problems, right? But as a corrective, I mean, in a way, even just like, I'm not saying like one should go entirely back to that, right? Like, but if we today, I think we have a tendency much more. I try to think about this. Right? We just don't speak in the same terms. We have a tendency maybe to talk more about structural inequalities and other types of things. And it's not that those don't exist at all. I don't want to be taken to be suggesting that, but I do think that there's a kind of health in the kinds of political discourse that one sees at this time, and actually among those who have a range of different religious persuasions. And so I'm not answering your question, right? But I guess I am in the sense that, yeah, I think maybe we would be better off, right, if it was more of a larger part. Like look, but I don't know if I want to. I'm not going to say that. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
No, having a minute or two, right, isn't fair. But I think that it's just really interesting because it's not a religion, right? And you brought that forward, and I thought this percentage of letters to Jews was pretty impressive within that time. But I just think it's really interesting because it seems that that's really a threat to democracy. So the less church, so to speak, people are. So I just thank you. Really got me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, interesting. By the way, just it is very interesting to see how Judaism is included at this period in certain ways as one of the denominations. And that, right, some of you might know, right, famously when King's College was established as Columbia College, the board of it's not the trustees or something like this, right? By a rule, there had to be a representative from each one of the major denominations in New York City on the board of trustees. It was called something, regents or something. And so the chazan from the shul from Seychelles was on the first board of Columbia because Judaism was considered one of the major denominations in New York. So that, anyway, sort of interesting.
Judy, I saw your hand was up. Did you still want to say something before we wrap up?
I was just wondering whether there was any communication from any of the native tribes to Washington and a similar communication back from him, because obviously these are all people that he considered denominations of Abrahamic white religions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am just ignorant, so I would love to know more about that, and I just don't know. I'm sorry.
I was just curious.
No, it's a great question, and thank you for it, because I will look into it myself now.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tugendhaft. It was a great presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Our next class will be next Thursday on July 13th, How the Jewish Awakening May Transform American Religion with Rabbi Joshua Stanton. That'll be at 1 p.m. Pacific, so we hope you can join us for that as well. And thanks again for being here, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.